Welcome. So before we get started today, the session is being recorded, as you'll note at the top of the agenda. And we're doing that for friends who aren't able to join us today because of one reason or another. And it will be posted on the PLACE, that's Professional Learning and Community Education website soon. And so for any colleagues you'd like to share this with, it'll be there, usually within a couple of weeks. Welcome, everyone. I see some connections happening in the chat. That's always exciting. Before I forget, last time I realized after it was all over, I was telling AJ this, but I didn't even introduce myself. So my name is Sandra Taylor Marshall. I work for PLACE in the School of Education at UW-Madison. I am the instructional coaching program coordinator. We have an instructional coaching program, student-centered instructional coaching program, and it's completely online. And I coordinate that program and teach within it as well. So please check out our site. We offer lots of professional learning opportunities for teachers. And as I mentioned, if you would like to add your name and where you're from and what your professional role is in the agenda, that would be great. Then we know who we're talking with. And you'll notice that we have people here from all over the world. I am so honored and happy that I get to work with people from all over the world in my role. And so it's really exciting to see who joins these conversations. Before we get started today, just a few reminders. Again, if you haven't already, if you can please mute your microphones. That's helpful so that we don't, hear all the background noise that's going on where you are. And then if you have a question or, when we engage in conversation, feel free to use the chat feature, turn on the microphone, use the raise hand feature, anything like that, because a little bit later in the conversation, we do want this to be interactive and have conversations with all of you and about what's happening in your professional context, in your schools and in your districts. All of those features, I'm assuming with Zoom, I haven't heard about any of the latest updates, but they're usually right along the bottom of your screen. And so you can find those features there. Other virtual working agreements, just remember that today during our collective conversation that we're here to critique ideas and not people. And we really invite you to engage in conversation today. And we know that that conversation looks different among everyone who's here. And some people will feel empowered and excited to engage in conversation using their voice. And some others will decide to use their voice in a written format and do that via chat. And so I'll do my best to moderate that and share those questions and comments with AJ that way. And we'll also, if there are questions that we don't get to, AJ and I will discuss those and can reach out to you after the fact. So feel free to put those. There's also a section on the agenda where you can add questions if you so choose. Feel free to do it that way as well. And again, we just want to encourage and invite risk-taking. And we know that learning is messy work. And so we're all here to learn from one another and from each other's experiences. And so, we just invite you to participate in whatever way feels comfortable for you. The next section on the agenda, it's got the blue box for announcements. We invite you today to please share your feedback. That's really important for the work that I do, the work that AJ does, the work that our office, that PLACE does. As I mentioned, we do a lot of professional learning for educators. It's where we do equity and inclusion work. We are the home of Greater Madison Writing Project. Woot, woot. I'm a Greater Madison Writing Project fellow, and so it's really important work to me. We offer Power Up Real Teaching for virtual learning. My colleague Christina does Math Equity Project work, as well as Mathematical Discourse Series. We just have so many opportunities for folks around the world. And, our goal is really to meet the needs of the educators of whom we serve. And so check those out, but also check out the feedback exit slip and let us know what you're in need of, because, we're here to meet your needs. And then finally, today, we shared a couple of articles, and they'll continue to be in this space that we're going to use to ground our conversation today. Because we're so excited to have Dr. Anjalé Welton with us here today. And I'm so excited to have gotten to know her, and we just continue to grow in our friendship and in our work together. So I'm excited to introduce Anjalé. We also call her AJ. And Dr. Welton is a professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her scholarship examines how educational leaders both dialogue about and address race and racism in their school communities. Her research, specific to racial equity and justice, also considers the role of student and community voice, leadership, and activism in education reform and transformation. Some of her professional experiences include coordinator of a leadership and empowerment program for urban youth, a facilitator of an urban education teacher preparation program, and a teacher in large urban districts. She's also committed to providing professional development for educational leaders on issues of race and equity. And that's most recently what she and I have been talking most about. Her most recent co-authored book with Sarah Diem, University of Missouri, Anti-Racist Educational Leadership and Policy, Addressing Racism in Public Education, challenges schools leaders to question the racial implications of the policies they design and implement. And that's what we've been talking about when we get together, because most of the work that I do is also with school leaders, instructional leaders, teacher leaders, instructional coaches. And that's why she's here with us today. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, AJ, and joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, so I'm really grateful to Place for creating this platform. I'm a new faculty member here, and so this has given me the opportunity to share my work and ideas and get connected with others. I was at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign for almost 10 years, so I also see, like Christine, I see some of my former students and people I used to work with from in a professional capacity from the Urbana-Champaign community. So it's great that you're here. But yeah, today I just wanted to talk a little bit about whiteness and try to get us a little bit more comfortable with addressing whiteness, right? We're trying to get more comfortable with addressing race and racism, but let's try to get a bit more comfortable with talking about whiteness. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a little PowerPoint, and I'll probably turn my video off when I share the PowerPoint, because sometimes the bandwidth doesn't really, well, maybe it'll be okay. Can you hear me okay? Okay. All right. So I'm just going to spend about 10 minutes just, blanket defining what whiteness is. And so, we as educators work with our schools to start the journey of addressing racial inequalities. And we focus on talking about race, right? Because that is often seen, of course, it's often seen as the taboo subject or elephant in the room that people are uncomfortable with addressing. But we also need to emphasize talking about whiteness and normalizing and getting educators more comfortable with naming and identifying whiteness and how it operates. In my experience researching and working with school leaders in a professional learning capacity, I have witnessed how when educators individually and the school as a whole engages in whiteness, it delays and derails and sometimes even halts anti-racist work the leader's anti-racist work and objectives and goals. And I think one of the articles that was shared with you kind of talks about what happens when whiteness kind of takes over anti-racist efforts. So often when we engage in racial equity work, we focus on, of course, we focus on racial inequality and racism as the target. For example, by looking at data to examine racial gaps in achievement and so on. But we also need to, as a starting point, unpack whiteness. Because whiteness and white supremacy are responsible for racial inequities that exist in our schools. Okay, so whiteness and white supremacy are the foundation for racism and racial inequalities in schools. So, so when we diagnose the issue, right? Actually, the diagnosis should be positioned as how white supremacy and whiteness are the problem or the root cause, and that racism and racial inequality are the outcomes and consequences of white supremacy and whiteness. So viewing the diagnosis as whiteness as the problem then pushes us as educators to look for explanations for racism and racial inequality that are internal to our schools, right? Internal to our organizations versus externalizing and placing blame. So just real quick, what is white supremacy versus whiteness? White supremacy is the ideology, right? It's the ideology that white people and their ideas, thoughts, and beliefs and actions are superior to people of color. And throughout history, white supremacy and presently is used to gain power by devaluing and pathologizing people of color. And it is not by accident, it's purposeful through policies, programs, structures, and practices. And what I'm arguing here is that similar to racism, whiteness and white supremacy is often treated as the elephant in the room. But we need to name whiteness and white supremacy because they are the basis for racism. And just as a side note, for those of you who are facilitating professional learning in your own school communities or institutions, a tip that I often do, because sometimes you might have that one person or two people who try to get you off track and spend time and debate with you why racism does or does not exist. And so typically what I do when I start facilitating a professional learning workshop is right away I state that I'm not here to debate that race matters, because it does, right? However, we can begin to unpack why and how it matters to our community. So then whiteness is then, I said white supremacy is like the ideology and the system, and whiteness is the execution, right, of this ideology. And it's implicitly reinforced in society. And many white people often fail to see how their racial identity privileges them. Whiteness is taught in everyday life. There's a hidden curriculum to whiteness. White people and white normed institutions are socialized to invest and maintain and protect whiteness. But people of color can also reinforce whiteness. We work in white normed, people of color work in white normed schools, institutions, organizations. And so they play a role and part in reinforcing those policies and practices that are white normed. And so this socialization process is why it's important to acknowledge and hold ourselves accountable, for addressing whiteness and white privilege. So when working with educators to help them examine how whiteness manifests in their practice, I break whiteness up into two major categories, just big categories. I look at whiteness at the individual level, and then how whiteness plays out school-wide through our systems, organization, the culture, the norms and structures of the organization. And so here are just some readings that I suggest that kind of give good examples of these different components to whiteness in terms of our individual mindsets and attitudes and beliefs. Of course, I'm sure you're familiar with Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. Bree Picower, Picower, her concept of tools of whiteness, and Cheryl Matias's work, Matias, feeling whiteness. And then how whiteness plays out, again, school-wide through our systems, cultural norms and structures. Angelina Castaño's book, Educated in Whiteness, is a really good book to check out. I think it's linked in the Google Doc. And then Despite the Best Intentions by Amanda Lewis and John Diamond. And John Diamond is a colleague of mine in my department in ELPA here. So in terms of individual patterns and behaviors of whiteness, there's three concepts that I think do a nice job of describing what these individual patterns of whiteness look like. Bree Picower's work, she coined the term tools of whiteness. And she was doing work with white pre-service teachers who were taking a class on equity and social justice. And she noticed some patterns in terms of how they enacted whiteness in order to disengage and resist the topics in the course. And so there were emotional tools, ideological tools, and performative tools. And so these emotional tools were tools or feelings of emotive responses to the course content and discussions that were actually tools of protection to protect themselves and uphold their dominant frames and oppressive ideologies about race. And then the if I can say that tonight, the ideological tools were tactics used to avoid engaging in course topics that maintain their oppressive beliefs about race. And then the performative tools were ways in which they literally like acted out and performed that were in alignment with their oppressed beliefs. And then of course, again, the concept of white fragility. And this is when white people experience any amount of racial stress when engaging in racial dialogue or anti-racist work, and it triggers defensive moves. And then white guilt, even though Robin DiAngelo talks about white guilt as a product of white fragility, I would like to highlight it as a pattern, is where you're personalizing racism instead of taking the time to look at the structural and systemic aspects of racism. And white guilt leads, we get so consumed with white guilt that it paralyzes us and we feel like we can't do anything about it. And again, that delays progressing through anti-racist work. But I think any of these individual examples of whiteness can, in their own way, delay or derail anti-racist work. And then the school-wide, looking at systems school-wide that are evidence of whiteness, how whiteness takes place school-wide. And it's through our structures. How are our structures white normed in terms of discipline policies, examples, curriculum, homework policies or procedures, how students gain access to advanced placement, the structures that are white normed for that, how we engage the structures that we engage in families, with families, how are those white normed? And because these structures are white normed, then families and students of color are, configuring how to navigate these white norm structures. And then the organizational culture aspect is how is whiteness evident within our culture. And one strong research example of this comes from Irene Yoon, who's at University of Utah, and coined the term whiteness at work. And she worked with white teachers who were engaging in a professional learning experience specific to issues of equity and race. And they engaged in, behaviors of whiteness, and that were a form of resistance to the work. And she also observed these teachers in their classrooms and noticed that they get engaged in these same types of behaviors. And so she realized that this was actually embedded within the school, the organizational culture, reinforced in the organizational culture. And so whiteness was really used to, maintain a status quo and maintain business as usual practices, and really kept teachers from unlearning, their racist practices and prevented them from learning, how to be anti-racist. So whiteness is designed to, like I said, delay, derail progress towards racial equity and justice. And so when we don't name and identify and hold each other accountable for addressing whiteness, we are being silent and complicit in racism. And so I just leave you with some thoughts that I'm putting out there, ideas, anti-racist strategies of how can, what can school leaders and educators do, or what should they think about? So school leaders and educators should help white educators and community stakeholders take responsibility for whiteness and white supremacy. They should not capitulate to whiteness and even white stakeholder resistance to engaging in discussions about race and racism. School leaders and educators should directly name deficit beliefs and practices as racism. School leaders and educators should be accountable for their white racial frame and think about how their white racial frame may impact their decision making. They should work to prioritize righting racial wrongs and humanizing the people of color, students of color, and families of color in this process. Constantly do the head work, but don't stop there, and do that systemic work towards racial equity and social justice. And then school leaders and educators should lead by example. If you're doing this, if you're trying to be intentional about doing this work, you should lead by example. Because if you play into whiteness, your educators and students and families will think it's okay to do so as well. Okay, so spent a little time giving you my thoughts on what whiteness is, what it looks like.
Yes, thank you, AJ. A couple of questions. One that's come up that asked about the slides. No, we're not sharing the links to the slides, but AJ is going to be with us for just under an hour. So we're going to take about 2 or 3 minutes just for some quiet reflection. Let everybody kind of consolidate and think about, all those thoughts and facts and all that great information that AJ just shared.
Could I post the slide while we talk? Sure. Want me to keep the slides up? I see from my colleague, Madeline, Dr. Hafner. Okay.
So let's take just a couple of minutes for quiet reflection, and then we will engage in some conversation. And as you reflect, a couple of questions that we'd like you to think about are, what does whiteness look like in practice? And these are in the agenda as well in the yellow section. And then how can we recognize if we are participating in the culture of whiteness? And then the conversation that we'd like to engage in kind of focused on those two questions, but then what does courage look like in terms of naming and rejecting whiteness? What actionable steps can we take? What types of spaces do we need to engage in these types of conversations? And how do we create these spaces in our schools? For those of you that were with us in November, we started some of these conversations then with Maxine McKinney de Royston. And we know that we definitely have to have courage. And so, like I said, let's just take 2 minutes to simmer on all that we heard from AJ.
Oh, there
All right, as we come back together, if you have a question or something you'd like to share, um, feel free to turn your mic on and speak, post it in the chat. Uh, and if you have something you'd like to share or ask and somebody else is speaking, feel free to to use the raise hand feature so that we can see and make sure that, that we call on you. That's a really great, yeah, Tracy says in practice, whiteness looks like blaming students and their families for any negative outcomes. Defensiveness, I'm not racist. So thinking about what whiteness looks like in practice, externalizing versus internalizing how our racist, or excuse me, how our structures, beliefs may be racist. Things like these kids can't, or these kids don't. Silence, the absence of conversations. Just the phrase, these kids. Ooh, implicit biases. Thank you, Richard. As a man of color, I know I teach whiteness to save young Black boys. Intellectualizing rather than having the really hard conversations. Assuming that everyone lives like you, celebrates the same as you. Whiteness shows up in how teachers respond to students and student families in daily interaction.
Sandra.
Yeah, Tracy.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if Richard would want to expand or somebody else would want to expand on his comment. I'd love to hear more about that if this is an appropriate time to expand on that.
I'll leave that to Richard.
Sure.
Thank you, Richard.
Did you have a specific question or that you wanted to know, or?
No, I mean, I would just love to hear from you, like what an example of what you mean by that, and then maybe like how, if others see that or feel that, or what we can learn from that.
Sure. A lot of times in my conversations with young Black men, I kind of use the sports and the game kind of phrase. And what I tell them and teach them is that you have to learn this game, and which is the game of whiteness, in order to, one, like move forward in life. You have to understand all the ins and outs of it, starting from knowing how to behave when you're around white people, knowing that getting your education is important, because if you don't get it, then whiteness doesn't allow you to advance without it. And not just education, that's in every area of your life. Education, jobs, government, you name it, you have to learn a certain level of whiteness in order to fit in order to succeed and be accepted. And then of course, lastly, in order to survive, because when you have a strong voice as a Black man, it gets misunderstood as being, something violent or something negative. or something that, you know, people are afraid of. And I teach them that in standing up for yourself and speaking up for yourself and speaking your truth, that you have to be careful in the way that you do it, because it could lead to something, you know, negative. You know, you can get locked up, you know, you can get beat up, you can get killed, you can get arrested. I mean, there's so many things that happen when all you're trying to do is be strong as a man, and you keep getting misunderstood with everything that you do, or everything that you do is not good enough. You know, no matter if you don't speak well enough, if you don't work hard enough, if you're not kind, if you're not, you know, I feel like I have to always go above and beyond when I'm around a lot of white people, because I want to open the doors for the next black person that comes behind me. And I feel like if I'm not accepted, or if I'm not doing things the right way, then the person coming behind me will not receive a fair chance, or a chance at all, in whatever it is that they're trying to do. And that's just for starters.
Thank you, Richard, for
Yeah,
sharing.
thank you, Richard.
You're welcome.
As there was someone in the chat that said that, you know, hopefully we can get to the point where um, students of color wouldn't need to do that. I'm just curious thoughts.
I just think that's what anti-racist work is all about, is making it so that that is no longer necessary. It's someday, right? That's kind of the vision to me, shifting that.
Actually, can I share something else with you all?
Sure.
And I think we may have a couple of people, a couple of my coworkers here, but I think it's some kind of important. I think it was important for our staff. We had a PD where the staff of color were allowed to share their experiences with prejudice or racism within our building, and things that other staff weren't aware of. And I think in just being naive that it exists in our building, even with the people that we work with on a regular basis. And in my role as a special education assistant, and also as a behavior assistant, I get to go around the building to every classroom, and you know, and I get to see and hear things all the time. And I was, you know, I've heard some very inappropriate things that were said from staff, you know, about staff of color. And I'd like to share a couple of those things with you all, just so you can have an idea of just how, as an adult, you know, things happen, and how I feel as an adult about these things, just to give you, you know, just kind of open your eyes to some things that people don't believe actually happen. And I feel like when it happens with adults, it really makes you question what's really happening with the students of color. So I'm just going to read a couple of them off. I'm going to pause about 5 or 10 seconds and let you think about it, and then go on to the next one. So the first one was, and I apologize, I forget the principal's name. That was at Black Hawk before Jamie Sims. But the comment was made that, have you noticed since the previous principal, and especially now with the principal we have now, how dark it is around here? And that was in regards to there being more staff of color in the building. The second one, they may have better relationships with the African American students, but they don't teach as well as we do. Because Black students are struggling because of their own shit, less qualified Black teachers are being hired over obviously qualified white teachers. And the last one is, it was said that I've worked for several different administrators, but failure is going to happen with this kind of leadership. And that one's kind of on the kind of on the line, but from what I understand, it was meant towards the leadership of color. And this kind of goes to why I feel like, I have to go above and beyond and try and do my job better than the next person and act a certain way and talk a certain way and, in order for, myself and other staff and students of color to be respected and accepted. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for being courageous and for sharing that with us, for sharing your experiences.
Sandra, this is Tracy again. I just want to add that I think it's so important for those of us that are white that work in education to hear from our Black colleagues and to amplify their voices. And we have more power than we realize to be used in a way that that assigns competence and status to our Black staff members in ways, we have to go out of our way to do that. And I think that's something, that we can do very easily. We can listen and we can amplify those voices. We can say, wait, I want to go back to what Richard said. In a staff meeting, we can say, wait, Richard has said this 3 times. Why aren't we listening to Richard's voice? Like, we can do that. And I think I sometimes I don't hear that. I hear the silence after a Black staff member speaks, which then just tells that Black staff member to continue to not share because we're really not sure, whiteness isn't really sure how to respond to you, which just keeps us in that, horrible cycle. So I guess that would be, something that I keep reminding myself and others is like amplify those voices, listen and find what you agree with and what, challenge what you don't agree with and find a way to honor that information and get it to be more widely heard. And that's something that we can do.
Which goes right along with that question, how do we create these spaces in our schools? So my son's best friend is Black and his roommate at college. And he moved in first, my son's friend. And when we got there, I remember this distinctly this fall that my son is white. He's 6'5". He's a big kid. And he made some statement to my son about wanting to go and check out the campus, and that he and his roommate is not a small kid, but he's definitely a minority on campus. And he basically made some statement to my son that he was afraid to do that. And he didn't say it was because he was Black, but I had to like turn and leave, because exactly what you're talking about, Richard. I just, like, this is yeah, it's like another child.
Mhm.
And so, we're creating spaces like this because we need to talk about this. And so how do we take actionable steps from, how do we do this here among ourselves to then take it back to our schools?
Yeah. So I'm a Black woman who teaches mostly white future school leaders about issues of race. And I think, that can be exhausting, but I'm getting to the point where I don't necessarily feel like it's my responsibility, but it's actually freeing for me. I've gotten to the point where it's actually freeing and therapeutic for me to teach about issues of racism to white educators and future white leaders, because they're actually listening to what I have to say as a Black woman, right? They're actually listening and learning. Because I think oftentimes, based on what Richard shared, it can be very frustrating. I think I put in the comments, when as a person of color, you are brave, and you and you name racism, and you call it out, and you're not listened to. It can be even more frustrating when I've seen this happen as well, where when a white person talks about it and addresses it, they're more so listened to than the person of color. So yeah, Richard, I feel you. So I think for me, people often say, oh, well, you don't need to feel responsible for teaching white people. But at this point, this stage of my career, it actually is therapeutic, because I feel like I'm being listened to. I'm teaching, I'm, using my research and work to educate white people about how whiteness works, and they're listening. And that's really important, because I've been in situations and spaces where I haven't been listened to.
One of the things that I've most recently been trying to do, I've been, as a coach, been teaching a course and working with coaching other coaches. And a lot of those coaches are involved in like intervention teams, or among groups of teachers who are, kids are brought, when there's issues, to discuss them. And one of the questions that I've been asking is, who's who's responsible for, are we putting the responsibility on the students, or are we putting the responsibility on the teachers? If a student's, I think, as we all know, like this virtual environment is making things even more apparent than it was before. And so when we use that word, a child's not engaged, well, or a child's disengaged, what does that mean? And what have you tried? What does that look like? And is it the child who's not engaged, or is it, what is our responsibility then as an educator to engage that child? And what have we tried, and what are we doing? And so that's one of the questions that I've really been trying to push is, have we tried small group? Have we tried one-on-one? And I know as educators we're exhausted, but so are our kids. And so they deserve more too. So
You know, something, Sandra, that you just brought up reminded me of an interview that I just watched of Dr. Latson Billings talking about student engagement. And she asked this question about, like, we have this expectation of students being engaged in what we as teachers want our students to be engaged in, when in reality it's like, what do our students want to be engaged in, and how do we as teachers get to know the students and find different avenues that will engage them, because like what we want them to be engaged in is like reading, writing, math, but that's maybe like what we're picking for them is maybe like boring, and they like don't want to engage in that. So how do we, you know, she used the example of like students who are interested in like social justice, and it's like, how can you like create a survey and analyze the data and have that be kind of how you hook them and how you engage them. And it was just a really powerful way to think about, particularly because we're having the same discussions in our virtual school, right? It's like, we have these students, many of them are students of color. It's like they're disengaged. How do we engage them? It's like, what are we doing? What have we tried? But also, how are we changing what we're doing instead of trying the same thing? And how do we adjust and adapt to better fit their needs?
Yeah, make a good point. How are we changing? How are we learning? That's really important.
Well, I think it's difficult for teachers when they're expecting you to teach towards a test or towards standards and things like that, as opposed to trusting the professionals that they hired to figure out, you know, what's best for these kids to learn and what's engaging, what would be more engaging. You know, I think we have to get away from, and it's just my personal opinion, a lot of the testing they feel is so important when I don't feel that it is. I think it's more about getting them excited about learning and wanting to learn and get them to ask questions and to kind of take control of, you know, what they want their futures to look like and things like that. And when teachers are being pressured so much to teach towards that test or these standards, it just takes all that away, all that creativity, that, you know, that passion away from teachers, because that's what teachers really wanted to do in the beginning, was, you know, use their passion to, you know, to motivate kids to want to learn and be successful in life. They didn't want to teach towards a standard, you know. So where do we draw the line there to give teachers back some of that power to do that?
I'm looking like, where are we on this Google Doc? I am curious if any of you have any tips, tools to share of how you're creating the spaces to openly talk about whiteness and name it in your schools, and to do the anti-racist work. Are there some suggestions of things that you find that are effective in terms of creating that culture where it's okay to address these issues?
And so one of the things that we're doing, I happen to be over a smaller group. We call them professional learning communities, and ours is race, climate, and equity. And one of the things that we're doing is inside of our smaller PLC, we're doing PD work themed around creating that brave space to talk about race. So similar to what I think Richard, I think you mentioned, one of our first go around was to look at our group and then to decide to let those individuals who were non-white, so that would have included anyone that was non-white, to share their experiences with uh, racism and just growing up. And afterwards, we flipped it the next meeting. So we let the whites, and so we drew this like a T chart. And then we started to identify the obvious things that were privileged versus those things that, you know, truly people were not privy to have. And one of the good things that came out of it is there were a number of our white teachers who were like, I never knew you all had it that bad. I never, and so the move for us to create these same spaces for students has just begun, because we're just getting our smaller group to be like comfortable enough to talk about race, but we are in charge of rolling it out to the whole school. And so we are carefully picking like that implicit bias model, and we are going to be just introducing each week at our staff meetings a snippet of what implicit bias is. We're going to have staff to take the Harvard grad school's implicit bias test. We're going to start to ask individuals to self-assess where they are, and then to identify things that can be done when we find ourselves in situations where we are acting on a bias and not out of the love and care and compassion and understanding for kids that may not have been as privy to things that we have been. And so I appreciate everyone sharing, because this just gives me more to take back to my smaller group, so that we can roll out this plan with a little more fidelity based on the feedback from you all.
See some examples placed in the chat. One of someone said that, I'm just curious, if you feel like, what do you do if you feel like you're alone in doing this work? If you feel isolated and your white colleagues aren't speaking up against bias, and so it creates that culture of mistrust. How can you get support, get allies, build coalitions in doing this work? I'm just curious, any thoughts about that? Someone made a comment, which I think is something important to bring up. How do you build trust when doing this work? And that goes along with the question of spaces and creating these spaces.
Several people have mentioned doing a book study, grounding it in, starting there gives it something to ground the conversation, and it becomes, less, about me or about that person. It, gives you a starting spot. And I wonder, and then, having it be optional, or, it could be an all staff, it could be it could be different book studies, perhaps there are, maybe there are 2 or 3, depending on how big your school is and your administration. But, I know that there are times where you can pick 3 or 4 choices and people get to choose which one they want to do. And then people can, teachers can, when they're done reading, they can also share out what they've learned. But sometimes that's a little bit less threatening.
Yeah.
More about learning, as opposed to, it's just a more natural way to kind of dig into the work.
Yeah. Someone, Mary Jo put honoring every voice and having norms,
Mhm.
educating myself as a white woman. And then those of you who are doing the book studies and that that ongoing learning, have you seen it? I mean, you're always doing the learning, right? That's important, always doing that learning. But at what point does it pivot? Have you seen that pivot to when that learning then turns into changing our behaviors and practices? What's the tipping point? I'm just curious.
So we, at CISA 2, we were doing book studies around equity and whiteness. And we decided, the group that was in the book study decided to ask our executive leadership if we could create an anti-racist equity statement that would guide our agency as sort of part of our mission and vision. And so we're in the process of doing that now. And that all came because we were doing book studies and we found such a strong alliance of people who all felt that we needed to take a strong stand in the work. And so I feel like that's an outcome of the book study and the fact that we got together and found our voices.
And I just want to add, not necessarily a book study, but at Black Hawk, every week during our PD time, we're doing at minimum 30 minutes all the way up until hour and a half, 2 hours every week on doing some kind of anti-racism or, work of, that kind of work. And this is every week at our PD. And I would say that they're very dedicated to making these changes and making sure that everyone is committed to doing the work, both for themselves and for our students and families.
Mhm.
And I mean, when I say every week, it's every week, and some people don't like it, but our staff is very adamant about doing the work and, trying your best to participate and do some deep soul searching. And I think to answer one of the questions on the person who said something about not feeling safe or something like that, I just say, you know what, just speak it. You have to tell yourself that what you're doing is the right thing. And I think once you address your staff, be it at a PD or through email, and you put it out there that you're dedicated to the work and I think you'll be surprised at how many people will join you and support you in the work. I mean, there's a lot of people, I think, who are afraid to step forward and speak up. But I think knowing that there's someone else out there, I think they'll, may get one or two in the beginning, but then you just build that group, and you have to be honest and speak your truths, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's not popular, and even if it's gonna, rub some people the wrong way. I think it's the only way that this work is gonna get done. And we all have to feel uncomfortable in doing this work. I mean, I'm uncomfortable every day, and I think it's okay for everyone else to be a little uncomfortable about how they feel and how they think. But if it's honest, it's honest. I mean, and I think we can have like open discussions and, and things like that in a safe place to where you should be able to share your true feelings and thoughts and fears and your uncomfortableness and, and work towards the goals that you really say you want. I mean, we have to get away from saying everything that's politically correct and what we think people want to hear. And, like I say, when you ask people, where do you want your kids to grow up? And you give this answer about this neighborhood and this community of this big melting pot of everything. That's what you say you want. But if that's what you really want, then that's the kind of work that you have to do in order to make that happen. Same thing in the school and with this work. Don't just give an answer you think people want to hear. Give your truth and then work that in that direction.
So, Richard, what I'm hearing is modeling commitment maintaining and sustaining commitment to the work. And so when you model commitment, we're committed to doing this, then it eventually becomes, it becomes part of our everyday, how we breathe, our daily work. It becomes institutionalized if we model that we're committed.
Right. Just like a basketball player, they're going to keep dribbling that basketball every day
Yeah.
until they get comfortable with dribbling between the legs and around the back,
Takes practice.
It takes a
Eventually.
lot of practice and a lot of hours and a lot of time, and but we can get there. That's
Yeah.
the thing, we can get there.
Oh, I see someone mentioned Darut Consulting. That's one of my buddies, Dakota Irby. Someone uses Darut Consulting to do anti-racist. And then Lisa, sorry, I'm scrolling. Is there a way, Sandra, to some of these recommendations and ideas to convert them to the Google Doc that are in the chat?
I can do that later.
We should probably yeah.
Yeah, the other thing that I noticed in here, somebody mentioned, I was thinking about this earlier, somebody mentioned talking to students, bringing students in and having them speak. And then something else AJ and I just talked about the last time we met was school board members.
Yeah.
Thinking about like whole school wraparound. Like I know some schools will bring in like lunch ladies and bus drivers and custodians, and like it's not just about teachers. It's really like building that whole culture. And it's thinking if you're going to do a book study, why not include parents and families and community. Like how do you? It's really about everyone. And I'm not saying it has to be a book study, but bringing in students and hearing from them and engaging them. Like, what are your experiences? Like Richard shared with us. We need to hear from them. What are your feelings? What do you? School board members.
They have a lot of power in terms of, they're the ones that approve the curriculum. They're the ones that hire your superintendent. They're the ones that hire you in terms of approving your jobs as a teacher. So
contract renewals.
Yes, contract renewal. So they need to engage in this. They need to be a part of the learning as well.
This is important work, and we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I think people reiterated in the chat, it's practicing, modeling that discomfort, and just practicing that this isn't taboo. This is something that we need to do. Like this is something we need to talk about. We need to name it. We need to identify it. We need to talk about what these behaviors look like, what these structures that are problematic look like. So by talking about it, then we have the tools for how to identify them, right? And oh, thanks, Lisa. You're posting, Lisa Barker, posting links to some of the work that's been mentioned that you say that you use, like Dakota Irby. He was a guest, right? For the Real Talk, Real Change. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's,
oh yeah, you put the link to the Real Talk, Real Change.
Yes, and Madeline, she put an excellent resource on student voice, honoring Black students' aspirations.
Thank you, Madeline.
And another one, Ariel Midwest documentary, High Hopes in Higher Education, Honoring Black Students' Aspirations, explores evidence-based programs in Wisconsin, focused on supporting Black students' higher education aspirations. This is a great question. Christine asked.
Yeah,
Do you see this?
Do we think it's possible to carry this work in buildings without strong in building leadership? I think both teacher and school level principal leadership, I think it's important, that you, feel like you have the skills. I mean, I know you feel like you have the skills to do this work. And if you are still learning yourself, at least you're modeling that you're learning and you're being open and honest about this learning. So you think the staff group can nudge leadership and keep nudging and planting seeds? So like that bottom up kind of influence? I mean, I do think it's very important for leaders to at least at a baseline exhibit that they're committed to doing this work. Because I feel like if they don't show that they're committed, I think it can be, from what I've observed, it can be very difficult, to engage in that school-wide or district-wide change. But yes, I think it has to start somewhere.
Yeah, and I do agree with I agree with what Mary Jo said about, the staff group. I think what Richard said earlier is important. Like, I think when you start having those conversations, I do think, those allies start popping up. And it's, once you start having them, you start hearing from other people that they see things too, they hear things too. And I think it's hard to be the first to kind of break that ground, though. It's hard to start having the conversations, but we have to have the conversations. So, hopefully the more you have them, the more they'll happen. And then I guess I'm just, hopefully that snowball is just going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And maybe leadership and administration will have to do something if you continue to nudge them. That's my hope anyway. I'm going to hang on to that hope.
Well, I think that when things are going well, with those conversations and there's a lot of positive things coming from it, I think that, leadership will tend to jump on board, to be a part of that positive, that positive movement. And then I think it'll turn into like them also wanting to facilitate and encourage and motivate the work to continue.
Yeah. But back to your question, Christine, I guess because that's where I situate my work is in leadership. I think it's crucial that they are committed and are demonstrating commitment. Even if they are reluctant, they're still learning. You still need to display commitment to doing this work. I think that's essential to doing that school-wide change.
I think also this has to be a lifestyle, and ask yourself, do you truly have an unconditional love for people anyway, outside of this work, and do you bring that love for people and change and things like that? Do you bring that into the building with you? Do you bring it into your classroom? Do you bring it into your teaching, and how you interact with our students and their families? And I think it's hard to do this work if you don't have that unconditional love for people.
Yeah.
And wanting what's best for people.
So someone posted an example in Burlington of teachers. There was a bottom up kind of movement in terms of.
I think Mary Jo left, but
Okay.
what actually happened in Burlington was a teacher she did some anti-racist work with her 4th grade students over the time. Yeah. Okay. So that was the background there. But I think for me, the whole part of this is, I think, Richard, I'm right there with you, that love and compassion for everyone, but also that this work is so crucial now. It's always been crucial, but when we look at students, how do we not move forward? And that's what our conversations are grounded in our district, in the groups that I'm part of. Like when we start getting off track, at least one person in the group says, wait a minute, how do we not look at what kids are going through today? How do we not fix this today? We can't wait for somebody to get comfortable, to feel better about themselves, to be ready for the work, because that kid today can't wait for you anymore.
Can't wait. Nope. Yeah, that's a really good point. And thinking about goals and next steps, I know when people ask me, how do I know that I'm doing this work, that I'm making a difference? And they say, oh, look, I need to look at my data, or I need to do this. I think, the rubric should be, are you still committed, to your point, are you still committed to engaging in this work, down the road when you revisit and evaluate your progress, 6 months later, are you still committed to engaging in anti-racist work, talking about whiteness, addressing it, and how it's connected to racial inequities that you're seeing in your schools? Are you still committed to doing the work? I think that's a goal.
Right. And moving
That's a
from
goal.
words to actions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not, the measuring stick doesn't have to be compared to the person next to you.
Yeah.
I think too often it's about what this person and this person is doing, and what is a step that that you can take, that you can move forward with.
Yeah.
So before we all say goodnight for the evening, I just want to thank AJ for joining us. These are tough conversations,
Yeah.
but they're conversations that we have to have. I'll go back through the chat tonight and look through some of those resources and add them to the agenda, so you can check back on that. And we'll also be adding the recording to the Place website. That'll take a little bit of time. It might be slowed down some because of winter break,
Yeah.
but it will get there eventually.
And please stay in touch. And it also seems like this group, this is a nice network. Like those of you who have returned to these sessions, like this is a nice network that you formed, that you can, a global network, as Sandra said, that you can reach out to and support one another in doing this work. So use it. You have power here.
That's right. And we can lean on each other.
Yeah.
We can share ideas, and
Yeah.
this is a safe space to do that.
Yeah.
Please take a couple of minutes to share your feedback. The link is in the chat. And thank you all for being here. We appreciate you, and
thank you.
enjoy
Take
your
care,
winter
everybody.
break.
Yes. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Richard, for sharing.
Take care, everybody. Appreciate you all.
Thank you. It was great to see you, AJ.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Christine. Literally, right as you logged in, Joe Email texted me asking for my address to send holiday card.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. What a small world, right?
I know.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye.
This is great, Sandra. I mean, so there are several returners that have attended many of these.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you definitely do have a nice network going here.
Yeah, there are several who who come every month.
Yeah.
And then there's some who who come when they can, or I got a few emails today like, oh, I can't make it today, will this be recorded? And but yeah,
to add more things. I'm like, okay, well, now that this network, like what could we do with this network of people that are invested in? That's pretty cool, I have to say.
Yeah, well, thank you for for doing this. I mean, this is
Yeah.
a, you know, I just, you're so, I feel so lucky to know you. You're so
Oh,
smart.
thank
And
you.
so I just learn so much from you every time I talk with you. And
Yeah.
I'm just, yeah, I just am very invested in this work. And
And
I'm,
they had some good examples in the chat. It seems like and maybe that's something we can talk about later when we meet in January. It seems like the books doing like book studies and like are a starting point for many people. And so you know, how can they leverage that? Because I saw a couple of people comment that they haven't gotten to that tipping point yet. So what are some, I know it's contextual, but like, you know, what are some ways that you can, you know, leverage that book study opportunity into you know, a tipping point.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know that's, like I said, that one of the things that I've been trying to do is, you know, I've really been trying to, and granted, I know these people, I've known them for a year and a half, so which affords me an opportunity to do that, but I've really been trying to push or nudge, I like to say nudge gently, kind of depending on where they are, but kind of to take that next step, like, okay, you know what, so thinking about how, even just how might they be able to question or ask questions of colleagues, like in an inquiry oriented feedback type of way, or a reflective, you know, incorporating some reflection to spur a conversation rather than just conversation about the book.
Yeah, I think that's something to think about, like how can we help? How can that tipping point?
I also love the idea of bringing in students, but when you're in a primarily white district, like where my kids were, that can also be really, that's tough to do, obviously.
Yeah.
I'm excited to think about like the next step. What can we do? What can we do next?
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that conversation in January.
Well, this is like, again, I commend you. This is great. You've definitely worked hard, and you've got a network of people who, this is really cool.
Thank you. And thank you for spending your evening and the rest, enjoy the rest of your night.
I'm gonna try to stay up a little late and grade papers. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I'm trying to finish the last one, the last projects. They're pretty cool, so it's been good. It's been nice.
So, all righty. Well,
all righty. Take care. Happy holidays, and I'll see you in January.
Yeah.
All right. Take care. Bye.